Picture this. You're sitting across from your daughter's ex-boyfriend at a restaurant in downtown Washington, D.C., making small talk, laughing about old times, and the entire time he's looking you straight in the eye, knowing he brutally murdered your mother 23 years ago. And you have absolutely no idea, because how could you? This was someone you trusted, someone who was practically family, someone who sat at your dinner table and celebrated birthdays and holidays with you. And he's just sitting there acting like nothing ever happened, while your mother's killer stands right in front of you smiling. That's exactly what happened to Lauren Prieur in 2023. And when she found out the truth a year later, she told reporters, "How you could look someone in the eye and know that you committed this crime and act like nothing happened is pretty unreal." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. We're talking about one of the most shocking cold case breakthroughs in Washington, D.C. area history. A case that took 23 years to solve. A case that destroyed a family twice over. First with a brutal murder, and then with years of suspicion cast on an innocent man who died before his name was ever cleared. This is the story of Leslie Prieur, a 49-year-old mother from Chevy Chase, Maryland, one of the wealthiest suburbs just outside the nation's capital. A woman who volunteered at her local library teaching English as a second language. A woman described by everyone who knew her as spectacular, loving, wonderful, the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. And on May 2nd, 2001, someone beat her to death in her own home and then vanished into the D.C. metro area for more than 2 decades, living a completely normal life while detectives had absolutely no idea who they were looking for. The breakthrough came from technology that didn't even exist when Leslie was killed: forensic genetic genealogy. The same technique that caught the Golden State Killer. And when Montgomery County detectives finally traced DNA from under Leslie's fingernails back to a suspect, when they finally had a name after 23 years of dead ends and false leads, and a community that never forgot, that name sent shockwaves through everyone who knew the family, because it wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some random intruder. It was Eugene Gligor, Lauren's ex-boyfriend from high school, someone who had been in their home countless times. Someone Lauren had dated for 5 years when they were teenagers. Someone the family trusted completely. On August 28, 2025, just weeks ago, Eugene Gligor was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Standing in a Montgomery County courtroom, claiming he couldn't remember why he killed Leslie, because he was having blackouts from drugs and alcohol. Refusing to give the family the one thing they desperately needed, an answer to the question that haunted them for nearly a quarter century: why? But let's back up, because this story doesn't start with the arrest or the DNA match or the detective work. It starts on a spring morning in 2001, when a sense of dread started building in a Chevy Chase office, and everything that seemed certain about this affluent neighborhood, this safe haven just miles from the nation's capital, was about to shatter into a million pieces that would take 23 years to put back together. May 2nd, 2001, started like any other Wednesday morning in Chevy Chase, Maryland, a neighborhood where people know their neighbors, where crime is virtually non-existent, where the biggest concern is traffic on Wisconsin Avenue during rush hour. Leslie Prieur should have been at work by 10 that morning. She was reliable, punctual, the kind of employee who never missed a day without calling. So when she didn't show up and didn't answer her phone, her boss, Brett Reedy, knew something was wrong. He tried calling her home. He tried her cell. Nothing, just rings and voicemail. And that knot of concern in his stomach started tightening, because this wasn't like Leslie. This wasn't normal. He called her husband, Sandy. He called her daughter, Lauren, asking if they'd heard from her, asking if she was sick, asking if maybe she'd mentioned an appointment they'd all forgotten about. But nobody knew anything. Nobody had talked to her since the night before. And now 3 people were starting to worry. Brett and Sandy decided to drive to the house together, just to check. Probably nothing serious. Probably she'd overslept or wasn't feeling well and her phone died. Reasonable explanations for an unreasonable feeling of dread. They pulled up to the Priya home at 4824 Drummond Avenue around 11:35 in the morning. A beautiful two-story house in a beautiful neighborhood. Everything looked normal from the outside. The kind of normalcy that makes what came next even more horrifying. Sandy used his key to unlock the front door. He stepped inside and immediately he knew. You know how sometimes you can just feel that something is terribly wrong even before you see it. That's what hit him the moment he crossed the threshold, because there was blood in the foyer. Not a little blood, not an amount you could explain away with a cut finger or a nosebleed. Real blood, serious blood. The kind that makes your brain scream that something catastrophic has happened in this house. They called the police immediately. Montgomery County officers arrived at 11:47 a.m., just 12 minutes after Brett and Sandy entered the house. But for the family, those 12 minutes probably felt like 12 hours of not knowing, of hoping against hope that maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked. Maybe there was some explanation. Maybe Leslie had fallen and hurt herself and was at the hospital right now, getting stitched up. But when the officers went upstairs to the second floor, when they found Leslie's body in an upstairs room, there was no maybe anymore. There was only the terrible certainty that Leslie Priya had been murdered in her own home, that someone had killed her with such violence that blood had been spattered throughout the house, and whoever did this was gone, vanished. Could be anywhere in the Washington D.C. metro area of 5 million people. The medical examiner would later determine that Leslie died from blunt force trauma and strangulation, multiple injuries, the kind of sustained attack that speaks to rage or panic or something dark that exploded in that house sometime between when her family last saw her alive and when her body was discovered the next morning. There had been a struggle. That much was clear. Leslie had fought back. Fought hard enough that she'd gotten her attacker's DNA under her fingernails, genetic material that would sit in evidence storage for 23 years, waiting for technology to catch up to justice. Montgomery County detectives immediately started processing the crime scene, collecting evidence, documenting everything, and what they found was puzzling, because there were no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest a break-in. Which meant either Leslie knew her attacker or they'd found a way inside without breaking down doors or smashing windows. The investigation kicked into high gear within hours. Detectives started interviewing family members, friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual, and almost immediately, suspicion started to focus on one person, Sandy Priya, Leslie's husband. Now I know what you're thinking. It's always the husband, right? Statistically speaking, most women who are murdered are killed by their intimate partners. So of course the police would look at Sandy first. That's just good detective work. But what happened over the next days and weeks went beyond routine questioning. It became a full investigation into whether this grieving husband was actually a murderer who'd staged a discovery of his wife's body to cover his tracks. Let's talk about why Sandy became such a strong suspect, because understanding this is crucial to understanding how this case went so terribly wrong for so many years. How a family that had already lost a wife and mother got dragged through the additional hell of public suspicion and private doubt. First, there were the neighbors' reports. Multiple people told police that the Priya household had seemed off in the days leading up to the murder. One neighbor specifically told investigators that the night before Leslie was found, he'd looked at the Priya house and noticed every single light was on, but all the drapes were closed. And he felt that was unusual, strange enough to mention it to detectives. The kind of detail that in retrospect takes on sinister meaning, even if at the time it was just a passing observation. Then there was Sandy's own interview with police, recorded just days after Leslie's murder, where he admitted that his marriage was strained, that things between him and Leslie had been difficult. And here's where it gets complicated, because Sandy was being honest. He was telling the truth about his marriage, but that honesty made him look guilty. He told detectives, and you can hear this in the audio that ABC's 2020 obtained for their documentary that aired just weeks ago in September 2025. He told them, Leslie was an absolute love, beauty when she didn't drink. She would have a lot, and in all honesty, it's one of the reasons why I'd kind of come home late, because it was getting hard to deal with. Imagine being in that interrogation room. Your wife has just been murdered. You're being questioned by police who clearly suspect you, and you're trying to be honest about the problems in your marriage because you think honesty is the right approach. You think the truth will set you free. But every word you say is building a case against you in the detectives' minds. Sandy's movements the night before and morning of the murder also raised eyebrows. He told investigators he'd been running errands, stopping at the dump, visiting 3 different stores trying to find a battery charger, and Detective Alison Dupuy, who would later be assigned to the cold case unit and finally solve this murder 23 years later. She told ABC News that Sandy's behavior back in 2001 was just a little bit suspicious. It seemed like he was trying to create an alibi for himself. Put yourself in the detective's shoes for a moment. You've got a dead wife, a husband who admits the marriage was troubled, a husband whose whereabouts the night before involved multiple stops at different locations, like he's establishing that he was somewhere else. Neighbors reporting weird behavior at the house, and then on top of all that, Sandy agreed to take a polygraph test, and he failed it. Now, polygraphs are controversial. They're not admissible in court in most jurisdictions. They're more of an investigative tool than actual evidence. But they're powerful in terms of shaping an investigation, and when Sandy failed that polygraph, it cemented in many investigators' minds that he was involved in his wife's death. Detective Tara Augustine, who also worked the cold case and appeared on that 2020 episode, she explained that polygraphs are tricky. They measure physical responses in your body, your heart rate, your breathing, your perspiration, and they try to correlate those responses with deception. But here's the thing. If you're sitting in a police station being accused of murdering your wife, if you know the police think you're guilty, if you're terrified and grieving and overwhelmed, your body is going to have physical responses, whether you're lying or not. Augustine said, I can see how he would have failed because it's a very stressful situation and the police think that he killed his wife. So you've got all these pieces building up. The troubled marriage, the suspicious timeline, the failed polygraph, the neighbor who saw all the lights on. And pretty soon, the original investigators had developed a theory. Sandy Prier killed his wife Leslie. Maybe they'd had a fight that escalated. Maybe there was anger about her drinking or their marital problems. Maybe something snapped. And then he staged the discovery of her body the next morning with her boss, Brett Reedy, to make it look like he was innocently checking on her. It's a theory that made sense on paper. It explained a lot of the evidence. It fit the statistics about intimate partner violence. And for a while, it looked like Montgomery County Police were building toward charging Sandy Prier with his wife's murder. The community started to whisper. Friends and family started to take sides. Lauren lost not just her mother, but also the security of knowing her father was innocent, because even she couldn't be sure anymore. How could she be when the police were so focused on him, when all these pieces seemed to point in his direction? But then something happened that should have cleared Sandy immediately, something that should have redirected the entire investigation, but instead it just caused the case to go cold for 2 decades. 2 months after Leslie's murder, forensic test results came back from the crime lab analyzing the DNA evidence collected at the scene. And here's what they found. There was male DNA under Leslie's fingernails. Genetic material from someone who had been in close physical contact with her during her final moments. DNA that almost certainly belonged to her killer, since it was under her nails from where she'd fought back and scratched at her attacker. And that DNA did not match Sandy Prier. It didn't match her husband at all. It belonged to an unknown male, someone who wasn't in any law enforcement database, someone who had no criminal record, someone completely unknown to investigators. You would think this would have ended the suspicion of Sandy right there. You would think detectives would have said, okay, we were wrong. The husband isn't the killer. Let's pivot and figure out who this unknown male is. But that's not what happened, because sometimes in investigations, especially in high-profile cases where police have invested significant time and resources building a theory, there's a phenomenon called tunnel vision, where investigators become so committed to their original theory that they have trouble seeing alternative explanations even when the evidence is screaming at them. Some detectives still suspected Sandy might have been involved somehow. Maybe he'd hired someone. Maybe there was an accomplice. Maybe the DNA was there for some innocent reason, and Sandy still killed Leslie through some method that wouldn't have left his DNA under her nails. These are the mental gymnastics that happen when investigators can't let go of their primary suspect, even after evidence contradicts that theory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, but mostly what happened is the investigation just stalled completely. They had DNA from an unknown male. They ran it through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system that contains genetic profiles from millions of convicted offenders, and got no hits, no matches, nothing. They ran it through Interpol's database, still nothing. And without a match and without any other leads pointing to who this unknown male might be, the case had nowhere to go. Detectives conducted hundreds of interviews. They followed up on tips from the community. They looked at everyone in Leslie's life, trying to find someone who might have a motive, someone who might have been in that house that night. But everything led nowhere. Every lead evaporated. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny, and gradually, inevitably, the Leslie Prior murder joined the ranks of Montgomery County's cold cases. Another unsolved homicide in a file cabinet. Another family waiting for answers that never came. The years dragged on. 2002, 2003, 2004. Each year, taking the case further from the public consciousness. Each year, making it less likely that new information would surface. Each year, making it harder for Lauren to live with the uncertainty. And for Sandy, the years were particularly cruel because even though he'd never been charged, even though the DNA had cleared him in the eyes of anyone who understood the evidence, the cloud of suspicion never fully lifted, the whispers never completely stopped. He lived the rest of his life knowing that some people in his community, maybe even some in his own family, wondered if he'd been involved in Leslie's death. Sandy Prior died in 2017, 16 years after his wife's murder. He died without ever seeing justice for Leslie. He died without ever having his name fully cleared in the public eye. He died not knowing that 7 years later, detectives would finally identify the real killer and prove beyond any doubt that he'd been innocent all along. For Lauren, the loss was compounded exponentially. First, she lost her mother in the most violent, traumatic way possible. Then she lived through years of suspicion being cast on her father. Years of not knowing if maybe the police were right, if maybe her dad had done this terrible thing. And can you imagine what that does to a person, to a daughter, to lose your mother and simultaneously wonder if your father killed her? To have your entire sense of family and trust and safety ripped away in a single morning, and then to watch your father die still under that cloud of suspicion, still without answers, still without justice. Lauren told reporters in 2024 after Gliga's arrest that she'd always known deep in her heart that her father was innocent. But knowing in your heart and knowing for certain are two different things. And the uncertainty, that's what tortures families in cold cases. That's what keeps them awake at night for decades. By 2020, the Leslie Prior case was 19 years old, nearly 2 decades of being unsolved. The kind of case that most police departments have dozens or even hundreds of. Cold cases that sit in storage waiting for that one break that probably will never come. Because how do you solve a murder when you've exhausted every lead, when you've interviewed everyone, when all you have is DNA from an unknown person who left no other trace of their identity anywhere in the system. But something was changing in law enforcement. A revolution was happening in forensic science that would eventually crack not just Leslie's case, but hundreds of cold cases across the country. A technique that was first used to catch the Golden State Killer in 2018, and then spread rapidly to police departments everywhere. And that technique was forensic genetic genealogy, the intersection of DNA analysis and traditional genealogical research. A way of using DNA not just to identify a specific person, but to identify their relatives, their family tree, and through that tree, narrow down to potential suspects, even when the suspect themselves has never been in a criminal database. The science behind genetic genealogy is fascinating, and I want to break it down for you because understanding how this works is crucial to understanding how detectives finally caught Eugene Gligor, 23 years after he walked out of Leslie Prier's house thinking he'd gotten away with murder. Here's how genetic genealogy works and why it's revolutionizing cold case investigations. When you submit your DNA to companies like Ancestry.com or 23andMe, or any of the consumer genetic testing services that millions of people have used over the last decade to learn about their heritage and find distant relatives, you're essentially putting your genetic fingerprint into a massive database that can be searched and compared against other genetic profiles. And while these companies have strict privacy policies about law enforcement access to their commercial databases, there are other databases, public databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, where people voluntarily upload their genetic information specifically to help with genealogical research. And these public databases can be legally accessed by law enforcement with appropriate legal authority. The process works like this. Investigators take DNA from a crime scene. They create what's called a genetic profile from that DNA, and then they upload that profile to these public databases to see if it matches anyone. But here's where it gets clever. They're not looking for an exact match, because chances are the perpetrator themselves hasn't uploaded their DNA to a genealogy website. Instead, they're looking for partial matches. For people who share significant amounts of DNA with the unknown perpetrator, people who are related to them, maybe a third cousin or a second cousin once removed, or even more distant relatives. And once they find these relatives, these genetic breadcrumbs, they can start building family trees, working backwards and forwards through generations using public records. Obituaries, birth certificates, marriage licenses, all the normal tools of genealogical research, until they narrow down to a pool of possible suspects who would be the right age, the right location, the right connection to explain why their DNA was at that crime scene. This technique caught the Golden State Killer Joseph James DeAngelo in 2018. It identified the perpetrator in dozens of other cold cases. And by 2022, Montgomery County detectives decided it was time to apply this revolutionary technology to the Leslie Prier case. They still had the DNA evidence from under Leslie's fingernails, carefully preserved in their evidence locker for 21 years, waiting for exactly this moment, waiting for science to catch up to justice. And they sent that evidence to a company called Othram, a forensic genetic genealogy laboratory that specializes in extracting and analyzing degraded DNA, creating enhanced genetic profiles that can be uploaded to these public databases. The submission happened in September 2022, and what came back was both exciting and daunting. They got hits. They got genetic matches, but they weren't close matches. They were distant relatives, hundreds or even thousands of potential family connections. And now someone had to do the painstaking work of building family trees, tracking down records, narrowing the possibilities, eliminating branches, following leads, and that work fell to two veteran detectives who had just been assigned to Montgomery County's cold case unit. Detective Tara Augustin had spent her entire career dreaming of this moment. Not this specific case, obviously, but the opportunity to work cold cases, to take investigations that had gone nowhere and look at them with fresh eyes, to give families like Leslie Pria's family the closure they desperately needed after years or decades of waiting. Throughout my whole career, my goal was to get to the cold case unit, Augustine told ABC News for their 2020 documentary that aired in September 2025. These are all major crimes. They're either homicides or rapes, and there are ones that haven't been able to be solved. And I like the challenge of trying to look at everything with fresh eyes. In 2022, Augustine got her chance. She was transferred from robberies to the cold case section where she was partnered with Detective Alison Dupuy, another veteran officer who shared her passion for solving cases that everyone else had given up on. And together they were handed the Leslie Pria murder, a case that would consume the next 2 years of their lives and ultimately lead to one of the most stunning cold case breakthroughs in Maryland history. Dupuy explained their approach to 2020. Doing this job, I want to help people. When you're in the cold case unit, you get to reconnect with families who otherwise probably have been feeling like they've been forgotten by the police department. And that reconnection started immediately with Lauren Pria, Leslie's daughter, who by 2022 had been living with her mother's unsolved murder for 21 years, who'd lost her father in 2017, still under that shadow of suspicion, who'd probably resigned herself to never knowing who killed her mother or why. Augustine and Dupuy made it a priority from day one to keep Lauren informed, to bring her into the process as much as they could, to show her that no, she hadn't been forgotten. No, her mother's case wasn't just sitting in a file cabinet gathering dust. Yes, someone was fighting for justice even after all these years. And that relationship, that connection with Lauren, became one of the most rewarding aspects of the investigation for both detectives, because they got to watch her go from resignation to hope, from hopelessness to healing, from uncertainty to certainty. But before any of that could happen, before they could bring Lauren good news, Augustine and Dupuy had to do something incredibly difficult. They had to set aside everything the original investigators had concluded. They had to clear their minds of the theories and suspicions that had dominated the case for 2 decades. They had to look at the evidence without bias, without preconceptions, without tunnel vision. Augustine explained this challenge. One of the challenges of cold cases is not taking the original viewpoints of the investigators that looked at it before. You have to take a step back and say, well, let's just look at the facts. And when they looked at just the facts, when they stripped away all the speculation about Sandy Pria's behavior and the failed polygraph and the suspicious timeline, what they saw was simple and clear. There was male DNA under Leslie's fingernails that didn't belong to her husband. The DNA almost certainly belonged to her killer. And identifying that DNA was the key to solving this case. Everything else was noise. They reviewed the original case file meticulously. Hundreds of pages of reports, interview transcripts, photographs, forensic analyses, tips from the public. And what struck them was how thorough the original investigation had been, despite its wrong focus on Sandy. The detectives in 2001 had done good work. They'd followed leads aggressively. They'd documented everything properly. They'd collected evidence carefully. They just didn't have the technology to identify the unknown male whose DNA was at the scene. And without that identification, without that crucial piece of the puzzle, the case had nowhere to go, no matter how hard they worked. But now, 21 years later, Augustine and Dupuy had something the original investigators didn't have. Forensic genetic genealogy, results from Othram, showing potential family connections to the unknown DNA. And with those results, they could start building family trees, narrowing possibilities, hunting for their suspect through his relatives' genetic profiles. The work was tedious, unbelievably tedious. The kind of investigation that requires patience and attention to detail, and the ability to spend hours and hours following genealogical leads that might go absolutely nowhere, building family trees with hundreds of names only to eliminate that entire branch, because the ages don't work out, or the geography doesn't make sense, or the timeline doesn't fit. They started with the lower match results, the more distant relatives, working their way through American family trees, following branches, checking public records, obituaries, social media, trying to narrow down from thousands of potential genetic relatives to a manageable list of suspects who would have been the right age in 2001, who would have had some connection to the Chevy Chase area, who would have had some reason to be in Leslie Preer's home that night. Month after month, they worked this case alongside their other investigations, building trees, eliminating branches, requesting more genealogical analysis from Othram, following leads, and for a year and a half, they made progress, but nothing definitive, nothing that pointed clearly to a specific suspect, nothing that would let them make an arrest. And then in June 2024, something changed, something that would break the case wide open and lead directly to Eugene Gliger's arrest within weeks. The highest DNA match in their genetic genealogy results, the strongest family connection to the unknown male at Leslie's crime scene, came back not to an American family tree, but to a family line in Romania. Eastern Europe, a Romanian family with genetic ties to whoever killed Leslie Preer, and suddenly Augustin and Dupuis were searching through Romanian genealogical records, trying to understand family structures in a different country, following naming patterns and immigration records and anything that might connect this Romanian family to someone who was living in the Washington, D.C. area in 2001. Augustin remembers the moment she made the connection. She was searching through publicly available records and articles about this Romanian family line, looking for any names that might be familiar, any connection, however tenuous, to the original case file. And she stumbled upon a surname that made her heart stop, Gligor, a distinctly Romanian name. And that name, Gligor, she'd seen it before somewhere in the thousands of pages of the original investigation. She knew she'd seen it, and she went back through the old reports, digging, searching, until she found it, there in the original case file, buried in the tips and leads that had been followed up on back in 2001 and 2002. Was a tip from January 30th, 2002, almost exactly a year after Leslie's murder, from a neighbor who'd previously lived near a family named Gligor. And this neighbor had called the police to say they'd been thinking about the Leslie Preer case. They'd learned that someone from the Gligor family had previously been associated with Leslie's daughter, Lauren. It dated her when they were younger, and the neighbor wanted to report this because the Gligor household had been problematic. Frequent police visits for noise complaints and nuisance issues, underage drinking, drug use, and the family had moved out of the neighborhood in August or September of 2001, just a few months after Leslie's murder. The tip hadn't led anywhere back in 2002, probably because there were hundreds of tips to follow up on, and without any direct evidence connecting this Eugene Gligor person to the crime, there was no reason to focus on him over any other potential lead. But now, 23 years later, with genetic genealogy showing a strong Romanian family connection, and this name Gligor appearing in both the genealogical results and the original case file, Augustin knew she'd found something crucial. She dug deeper into the tip, looking for the full name, Eugene Theodore Gligor, born November 9th, 1979, which meant he was 21 years old when Leslie was murdered. And here's where everything clicked into place. Eugene Gligor wasn't just some random person associated with Lauren. He'd been her boyfriend, her high school boyfriend, someone who dated Lauren for 5 years when they were teenagers. Someone who would have been in the Preer house countless times, someone Leslie knew and trusted, someone who would have had easy access to the home without raising suspicion. Augustin and Dupuis pulled up everything they could find on Eugene Gligor, and what they found was unsettling. He was still living in the Washington, D.C. area. He'd been there the entire time, just miles from where he'd committed murder, living a normal life while Leslie's family suffered through 23 years of not knowing. And he had no criminal record, which explained why his DNA had never appeared in CODIS. Why the original investigators had never been able to identify him through traditional database searches. Using the family trees they'd been building with the genetic genealogy results, the detectives determined that Eugene was a first cousin, twice removed from the genetic genealogy match they'd found in Romania, meaning he was exactly the right distance in the family tree to explain the DNA connection. And now they had a name, they had a suspect, they had someone they could focus their investigation on, but they didn't have proof yet. They didn't have Eugene's actual DNA to compare against the crime scene evidence. All they had was genealogical inference suggesting he might be the source of that DNA. And that's not enough to make an arrest. That's not enough to convince a prosecutor to file charges. They needed to collect Eugene's DNA directly and test it against the evidence from under Leslie's fingernails. And they had to do it in a way that wouldn't tip him off, wouldn't give him a chance to flee, wouldn't give him any warning that after 23 years of getting away with murder, the walls were finally closing in. The question was how to get his DNA. They couldn't just walk up to him and ask for a sample. That would alert him immediately. They couldn't get a court order to forcibly collect his DNA without more evidence than they currently had. So they had to do what's called an abandoned DNA collection, where they follow the suspect and collect something he discards, something that has his genetic material on it, something he's thrown away that legally becomes fair game for police to collect and test. So in June 2024, Augustine and Dupuy began surveillance on Eugene Glagor, tracking his movements, waiting for an opportunity. And that opportunity came when they learned he would be traveling through Washington Dulles International Airport, going through customs. And customs presented a perfect controlled environment for collecting DNA, because people going through security and customs screenings regularly handle items, drink from water bottles, use tissues, and then discard those items in trash cans right there in the secure area where police can easily retrieve them. On June 9th, 2024, Eugene Glagor went through a secondary screening at U.S. Customs at Dulles Airport, and during that screening, he took a sip from a water bottle. The kind of routine thing travelers do constantly without thinking twice about it, and when he was done with that water bottle, he threw it away, and the moment he discarded it, that water bottle legally became abandoned property that police could seize. And Augustine and Dupuy, working with customs officials, collected that water bottle and immediately sent it to the lab for DNA testing. And now came the excruciating wait. The days or weeks it would take for lab technicians to extract DNA from the water bottle, create a genetic profile, and compare it to the DNA evidence from Leslie Preer's murder 23 years earlier. And if it matched, if Eugene's DNA matched the unknown male DNA from under Leslie's fingernails, then they had their killer, they had proof. They had justice within reach after more than 2 decades. The DNA results came back within a week, and they were exactly what Augustin and Dupuy had been hoping for, but dreading in equal measure. Hoping for because it would solve the case and bring justice to Leslie's family. Dreading because it meant confirming that someone Lauren had trusted, someone she'd loved as a teenager, someone who'd been welcomed into the Preer home as practically family, had murdered her mother in cold blood, and then lived with that secret for 23 years, looking Lauren in the eye whenever they happened to run into each other around D.C., pretending everything was normal. The lab report was definitive. The single-source DNA profile obtained from Eugene Theodore Glagor's water bottle was a match to the DNA profile obtained from the evidence in Leslie Preer's murder. And not just a match so strong that the statistical analysis said the chances of it not being Glagor were 1 in 35 quadrillion, which for context is a number so large it's almost meaningless. 35,000 trillion. The kind of certainty that leaves no room for doubt, no possibility of mistaken identity, no chance that this was someone else's DNA. Eugene Glagor had been in that house on May 7, 2001. He had been in close physical contact with Leslie Preer during her final moments. His DNA was under her fingernails from where she'd fought against him, scratched at him, tried desperately to defend herself. And now finally, 23 years later, the evidence was irrefutable. Augustin and Dupuy prepared their arrest warrant on June 15th, 2024, laying out the evidence in a detailed affidavit for the court, the DNA match, the family connection identified through genetic genealogy, the old tip from 2002 placing Gligor in Lauren's life. The forensic genealogy showing Gligor fit the Romanian family tree, the water bottle DNA collection, the lab results with their astronomical certainty, everything documented, everything irrefutable, requesting charges of first-degree murder for the events that occurred on May 2nd, 2001, against victim Leslie Prier. And a judge signed that warrant, and now all that remained was the arrest itself, sending U.S. Marshals to pick up Eugene Gligor, to finally, after 23 years of freedom, bring him into custody and charge him with the brutal murder he thought he'd gotten away with. On June 18, 2024, U.S. Marshals arrested Eugene Theodore Gligor at his apartment in Washington, D.C., just miles from where Leslie Prier had lived, just miles from the Chevy Chase neighborhood where he'd committed murder as a 21-year-old. And he was extradited to Montgomery County, Maryland, to face justice in the jurisdiction where his crime occurred. And the news of his arrest sent shockwaves through everyone who knew the case, through the Chevy Chase community that had never forgotten Leslie, through the friends and family who'd waited so long for answers, and especially through Lauren Prier, who learned that her ex-boyfriend, someone she'd dated for 5 years, someone she'd introduced to her mother, someone she'd trusted completely, had killed her mom and then lived with that secret while occasionally running into Lauren around D.C. and acting like everything was fine, like he was just an old friend catching up, like he hadn't destroyed her entire family with his violence and his lies. When reporters reached Lauren Prier after Eugene Gligor's arrest and told her who had been charged with her mother's murder, her reaction was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a kind of horror that comes from realizing someone you thought you knew was actually a complete stranger, capable of unimaginable violence. "It's been a hell of a day," she told Fox 5 DC, her voice carrying the weight of 23 years of grief, suddenly reshaping itself into something even more complicated. "He was my ex-boyfriend, not just someone she'd known, not just someone who'd been around the family, but someone she'd been in a romantic relationship with, someone she'd kissed and held hands with, and made plans with and trusted with her heart when she was just a teenager trying to figure out life and love and who she wanted to be. And that person, that boy she dated, had murdered her mother and then pretended for more than 2 decades that everything was normal, that he was just an old friend, just someone from her past with fond memories of their time together. Lauren told DC News Now that she'd been terrified for years, explaining, "I had someone who had murdered my mom brutally, and they were out there. They were out there, they weren't arrested, and so yeah, I was skeptical of everyone, unable to trust completely, because somewhere in the Washington D.C. area was a person who'd killed her mother, and that person could be anyone, could be anywhere, could even be someone she knew and trusted." Which turned out to be exactly the case, but in a way she never could have imagined. She told reporters she'd always had suspicions about different people over the years. She'd wondered about neighbors. She'd considered various theories, but she'd never, not once, suspected Eugene Gligor, because why would she? He'd been her boyfriend when she was 15 years old. They'd broken up years before her mother's death. They'd moved on with their lives. And when she'd run into him that one time at a restaurant in downtown D.C. in 2023, just a year before his arrest, they'd chatted like old acquaintances catching up. And she told reporters, "I've spoken to him. He didn't seem weird, and how you could look someone in the eye and know that you committed this crime and act like nothing happened is pretty unreal." Let's talk about Eugene and Lauren's relationship, because understanding this history is crucial to understanding the psychology of this case. The betrayal that cuts so much deeper because of the intimacy that once existed between them. Lauren grew up in Somerset, a neighborhood in Chevy Chase, and Eugene lived nearby in Kenwood. Another affluent area. These weren't far apart. These were kids who went to the same schools, ran in similar circles, knew each other from the neighborhood and from social events. And they started dating when Lauren was 15 years old, when Eugene was a year or two older. Typical high school relationship stuff. Going to movies, hanging out with friends, that first love intensity that feels like the most important thing in the world when you're that age. They dated for 5 years, which for teenagers and young adults is a significant relationship. Not a brief fling, but something substantial, something where families get to know each other, where the boyfriend becomes a familiar presence at family dinners and holiday gatherings, where trust is built over years of shared experiences. Eugene would have been at the Prier house countless times during those 5 years. He would have sat at their dinner table. He would have watched TV with the family. He would have talked with Leslie about school and plans for the future. He would have been someone Leslie welcomed into her home because this was her daughter's boyfriend. Someone important to Lauren. Someone who seemed like a nice young man from a good family in a good neighborhood. And Leslie, who was described by everyone who knew her as warm and welcoming and loving, would have treated Eugene with kindness and hospitality the way she treated everyone. And Eugene, for his part, would have seen Leslie not as a stranger, but as a person, as Lauren's mother, as someone he'd shared meals with and conversations with and mundane domestic moments with over 5 years, which makes what happened on May 2nd, 2001, even more incomprehensible because this wasn't a stranger breaking into a house. This was someone who knew Leslie, someone she would have opened the door for without hesitation. Someone she trusted because her daughter had trusted him. The relationship between Eugene and Lauren ended years before Leslie's murder. They broke up like most high school relationships eventually do. People grow and change and move in different directions. And by 2001, they'd both moved on with their lives. Lauren was pursuing her own path. Eugene was doing whatever he was doing in his early 20s. And according to all accounts, the breakup hadn't been dramatic or contentious. It had just been one of those things that happens when you're young and figuring out who you are. So there's no obvious motive here, no bitter ex-boyfriend scenario, no recent conflict that would explain why Eugene would suddenly show up at Leslie's house on May 2nd, 2001 and kill her, which is part of what makes this case so disturbing. The apparent lack of motive, the senselessness of it. The fact that even Eugene himself, when he finally stood in court 23 years later, claimed he couldn't remember why he did it. Couldn't explain what led him to that moment of violence. Montgomery County State's attorney, John McCarthy, would later tell reporters that there was no known connection between Eugene and Leslie at the time of the murder. They weren't in contact. There was no ongoing relationship. Nothing to suggest why he would have been at her house that morning, which raises the haunting question that Lauren and her family will probably wrestle with for the rest of their lives. Why did Eugene Gligor go to Leslie Prier's house on May 2nd, 2001? And why did their interaction end with her death? We may never know the answer because Eugene has never provided one, has never given the family that final piece of closure. That understanding of motive and intention and what happened in those final moments. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We need to talk about what happened between Eugene's arrest in June 2024 and his eventual guilty plea and sentencing, because the legal proceedings reveal a lot about how this case developed and how prosecutors and detectives built their case against him. Eugene Gligor's first court appearance was on June 24, 2024, just 6 days after his arrest, and he appeared in a Montgomery County courtroom to be formally charged with first-degree murder, which carries the possibility of life in prison without parole in Maryland, and to hear the evidence against him presented by prosecutors. State's Attorney McCarthy stood before the court and laid it all out: the DNA match, the genetic genealogy that identified Eugene's family, the water bottle collection at Dulles Airport, the statistical certainty that the DNA under Leslie's fingernails belonged to Eugene Gligor and no one else. And McCarthy said something that resonated with everyone watching these proceedings. Science doesn't lie. Technology doesn't lie. This wasn't a case built on circumstantial evidence or witness testimony that could be challenged or questioned. This was hard science. This was DNA with certainty measured in quadrillions. This was as close to absolute proof as you can get in a criminal case. Eugene pleaded not guilty at that initial appearance, which is standard. Almost every defendant pleads not guilty initially, while their attorney reviews the evidence and explores options for defense. But pretty quickly, it became clear that Eugene didn't have a viable defense against the DNA evidence. You can't argue with a DNA match that has odds of 1 in 35 quadrillion. You can't claim mistaken identity. You can't suggest contamination or lab error when the science is that definitive. And Eugene's attorney, whoever they were, would have looked at this evidence and told him the hard truth. You're going to be convicted if this goes to trial. The only question is whether you get convicted of first-degree murder with a possible life sentence, or whether you plead guilty to a lesser charge and potentially get a more lenient sentence. And so, negotiations began between Eugene's defense team and the Montgomery County State's Attorney's Office about the possibility of a plea deal, about Eugene accepting responsibility and pleading guilty in exchange for a charge that would carry less time than a first-degree murder conviction. The negotiations apparently centered on the question of premeditation, which is the legal element that separates first-degree murder from second-degree murder in Maryland. First-degree requires proof that the killing was premeditated and deliberate, that the defendant planned it in advance and carried out that plan with intention, while second-degree murder covers killings that aren't premeditated but still involve malice and intent to cause serious harm or death. McCarthy explained to reporters that proving premeditation in this case would have been difficult. Not impossible, but difficult, because while the evidence clearly showed Eugene killed Leslie, there wasn't clear evidence that he'd planned it in advance, that he'd gone to her house specifically intending to kill her. And McCarthy told reporters, it's very hard to establish this, that a person necessarily premeditated the killing. Now, I will tell you this was a blunt force trauma case. There were multiple injuries. We've discussed this with the family internally, with some of the difficulties of going to trial and whether there would be a likelihood of a first-degree conviction. This is the reality of criminal prosecution. Sometimes you have to make strategic decisions about charges because taking a case to trial is risky. Juries are unpredictable. And if you overcharge and can't prove all the elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you might get an acquittal or a hung jury, and then the defendant walks free and you can't try them again because of double jeopardy protections. So sometimes it's better to accept a guilty plea to a lesser charge that guarantees a conviction and a significant prison sentence, rather than rolling the dice on a charge that might result in no conviction at all. McCarthy and his team discussed this with Leslie's family, with Lauren and with Leslie's siblings, explaining the options and the risks. And the family, who just wanted justice, who wanted Eugene held accountable, agreed that a plea deal for second-degree murder made sense if it meant guaranteeing that Eugene would be convicted and sentenced to prison, rather than potentially walking free if a jury couldn't reach a unanimous verdict on first-degree murder. On May 7, 2025, nearly a year after his arrest, Eugene Theodore Gligor stood in a Montgomery County courtroom and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Leslie Prior, formally admitting for the first time that he had killed her, that the DNA evidence was accurate, that he was responsible for taking Leslie's life on May 2, 2001. And for destroying her family's sense of safety and security and trust for 23 years. The courtroom was packed with more than 60 people, family members, friends, loved ones of Leslie, community members who'd never forgotten this case, all there to see justice finally being served, to witness Eugene taking responsibility, to hear him admit what he'd done. McCarthy told reporters after the hearing, "It doesn't bring Leslie back. But now they know who did it to her. There's no such thing as closure, but I'm proud of what we do together. And I'm proud of our continuing search to find creative ways to make people in this community safer. The guilty plea was historic for Montgomery County. McCarthy emphasized this repeatedly in his public statements, because this was the first time in Maryland state history that familial DNA, genetic genealogy, had been used to solve a cold case murder. This was groundbreaking forensic science being applied to bring justice to a family that had waited more than 2 decades. And McCarthy made clear that this success would pave the way for other cold cases to be solved using similar techniques. That the Leslie Prior case was just the beginning of a new era in cold case investigation. But using familial DNA in Maryland isn't as simple as just uploading a profile to a database and seeing what comes back. There are legal restrictions, limitations that the Maryland legislature put in place to protect privacy rights while still allowing law enforcement to use this powerful tool. And McCarthy explained these restrictions to reporters. In order to use the familial DNA database, police had to show that they'd exhausted all other avenues of investigation. It's sort of a last resort. These limitations were established by the legislature in Maryland. The limitations we have are different than some other states. In some states, familial DNA is more readily usable. The restrictions make sense from a civil liberties perspective. You don't want police routinely trawling through genetic databases looking for distant relatives of people who might be suspects. You want them to use traditional investigative methods first. DNA databases as a tool of last resort when everything else has failed. And in Leslie Prior's case, everything else had failed. 23 years of investigation had led nowhere. The DNA didn't match anyone in CODIS. There were no viable suspects, no witnesses, no physical evidence beyond that DNA, so genetic genealogy was absolutely appropriate as a last resort technique. And its success in this case validated the careful balance Maryland had struck between protecting privacy and allowing innovative forensic science. Eugene Gligor had no prior criminal history. McCarthy confirmed this publicly. No arrests, no convictions, nothing that would have caused his DNA to be entered into law enforcement databases, which is why he'd remained unidentified for so long, despite leaving his genetic material at the crime scene. And this is why genetic genealogy is so powerful. It can identify people who have no criminal history, who aren't in any database, who would otherwise remain forever unknown to investigators. The period between Eugene's guilty plea in May 2025 and his sentencing in August 2025 was a time of waiting for Leslie's family, waiting to hear how much time Eugene would serve, waiting to finally speak in court about the impact his actions had on their lives, waiting to see this long nightmare reach some kind of conclusion. Sentencing in Maryland for second-degree murder can range widely. The maximum is 30 years in prison, but judges have discretion to impose lesser sentences based on various factors: the defendant's history, the specific circumstances of the crime, statements from the victim's family, and everyone involved in this case knew that Leslie's family would have a lot to say at sentencing about what Eugene had taken from them. Not just Leslie's life, but 23 years of uncertainty, 23 years of suspicion cast on an innocent man, 23 years of fear and doubt and questions that had no answers until DNA and genetic genealogy finally provided them. During the months leading up to sentencing, more details emerged about what investigators had found, about the physical evidence at the crime scene, about the violence Leslie had endured in her final moments. Prosecutors revealed that there was blood throughout the house, not just in the upstairs room where Leslie's body was found, but in multiple locations, indicating either a struggle that moved through the house or an attacker who moved through the house after the killing. And the autopsy had shown that Leslie died from both blunt force trauma and strangulation, meaning Eugene had beaten her and strangled her. Multiple forms of violence, multiple injuries. The kind of sustained attack that speaks to either rage or panic or determination to ensure she was dead. DNA evidence had been found not just under Leslie's fingernails, but in other locations in the house. 3 separate DNA samples according to prosecutors. Samples that Eugene had failed to clean up after the murder. Evidence he left behind, thinking it would never be identifiable, never be traced back to him, because this was 2001, and genetic genealogy didn't exist, and CODIS had no record of him, and he thought he was safe, thought he'd gotten away with it. The fact that Eugene had stayed in the Washington D.C. area for 23 years after the murder struck many people as particularly bold or foolish, or both. He didn't flee, didn't try to disappear, didn't change his name or move across the country, or do anything to distance himself from the scene of his crime. He just went on living his life in the same metropolitan area where he'd committed murder, which suggests either he was confident he'd never be caught, or he was so disconnected from the reality of what he'd done that he didn't fully grasp the risk he was taking. Lauren had run into him at that restaurant in 2023. They'd chatted. He'd seemed completely normal. And you have to wonder what was going through Eugene's mind during that conversation. Did he think about what he'd done? Did he feel any guilt or remorse or fear that Lauren might somehow sense something was off? Or had he compartmentalized it so completely that he could genuinely act like nothing had ever happened? Like he was just an old boyfriend, running into an old girlfriend and reminiscing about the past? The neighbor's tip from January 2002, the one that mentioned Eugene's name in connection with the case, had specifically noted that the Gligor household had been problematic. Frequent police visits for noise complaints, underage drinking, drug use, and that the family had moved out of the neighborhood in August or September 2001, just months after Leslie's murder. This detail raised questions that were never fully answered. Did Eugene move away from the neighborhood because of guilt? Because being near the scene of his crime was too stressful? Or was it just coincidence, just a family relocating for reasons unrelated to the murder? And what about those reports of underage drinking and drug use? Were they relevant to understanding Eugene's mental state in 2001? Were they background context for what would later be his claim that he couldn't remember killing Leslie because of blackouts from substance abuse? Or were they just normal teenage behavior that had no bearing on the murder? We may never know, because Eugene has never given a full account of what happened that day. What led him to Leslie's house? What transpired between them? Why a violent confrontation erupted between a young man and his ex-girlfriend's mother, August 28, 2025. The sentencing hearing, 24 years, 4 months, and 26 days after Leslie Prior was murdered in her Chevy Chase home, and the Montgomery County Circuit Courthouse in Rockville, Maryland, was packed to capacity with more than 60 people filling every available seat. Family members wearing photographs of Leslie pinned to their clothing, friends who'd never stopped hoping for justice, community members who'd followed this case for more than 2 decades, Detectives Augustin and Dupuis, sitting in the gallery ready to see their investigation reach its conclusion, and Eugene Theodore Gligor standing before Judge David Lease, waiting to learn how many years of his life he would spend in prison for taking Leslie's life. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion. 23 years of grief and anger and confusion and loss, all concentrated into this one courtroom, this one hearing, this one moment of reckoning that everyone had been waiting for since that terrible morning in 2001, when Leslie was found dead in a family's world, shattered into pieces that would never quite fit back together the same way. Prosecutors Donna Fenton and Jody Mount stood before the court and made their case for the maximum sentence. 30 years in prison, the full extent of what Maryland law allows for second-degree murder, and they began by emphasizing the severity of what Eugene had done to Leslie. Not just that he'd killed her, but how he'd killed her. The brutality of it, the sustained nature of the attack, the multiple injuries she suffered, the blood throughout the house, the evidence that Leslie had fought desperately for her life, scratching at her attacker, leaving his DNA under her fingernails as a final message that would take 23 years to decode, but would ultimately bring him to justice. "Today is a day of reckoning," Fenton and Mount told the court. This wasn't just about punishing Eugene for a crime he committed as a 21-year-old. This was about accountability for 23 years of living free while Leslie's family suffered. 23 years of letting an innocent man live under suspicion. 23 years of denying the family the answers they deserved. 23 years of looking Lauren Prier in the eye and pretending he didn't know why her mother was dead. The prosecutors presented their sentencing memorandum to the judge, a detailed document laying out the evidence, the impact on the victims, the reasons why Eugene deserved the maximum sentence. And in that memorandum, they addressed something that would become a central theme of the hearing: Eugene's claim that he couldn't explain what happened because he didn't remember, because he'd been having blackouts from drug and alcohol use around the time of the murder. The prosecutors wrote, "This is a crime without a motive that the defendant is willing to admit, and the defendant is unwilling to admit his motive and the full extent of his horrific conduct." They were making clear to the court that Eugene was still not taking full responsibility, still not giving the family the explanation they needed, still hiding behind claims of memory loss and blackouts, rather than confronting the reality of what he'd done and why he'd done it. Whether Eugene genuinely couldn't remember, or whether he was using memory loss as a convenient excuse to avoid discussing his motive, we'll never know. But the effect on Leslie's family was the same. They would never understand why. They would never know what happened in those final moments. They would never get the closure that comes from understanding the chain of events that led to Leslie's death. Before the judge imposed his sentence, Eugene was given an opportunity to address the court, to speak directly to Leslie's family, to say whatever he wanted to say about the murder he'd committed and the 2 decades he'd spent living with that secret. And this was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Would Eugene finally explain himself? Would he give some insight into his motivations? Would he offer anything beyond the legal obligation of accepting responsibility that came with his guilty plea? Eugene stood before the court, tearful, emotional, and delivered a statement that was both an apology and a frustrating non-answer to the question everyone wanted answered. He spoke directly to Lauren and her family, apologizing multiple times for the pain he'd caused them, and you could tell he was genuinely distressed. Whether that distress was from guilt, or from facing consequences, or from the weight of finally having to confront what he'd done after 23 years of avoidance. We can't know what was in his heart, but the emotion was visible and audible. "I vaguely remember leaving the Prier house in the morning, but the rest is a blur," Eugene told the court. According to reports from multiple news outlets who covered the sentencing, "I know Lauren and Leslie's family want to know why I was there and what happened. I'm sorry. I'm unable to remember and provide an explanation." He claimed that in the days leading up to the killing, he'd been experiencing blackouts, periods where his memory was unreliable or absent entirely. And he said he remembered entering the Drummond Avenue home, but everything after that was unclear, fragmented, lost to whatever combination of substances and mental state he was in at the time. It's an explanation that raises more questions than it answers. If he was having blackouts, why did he go to Leslie's house? What was his reason for being there? What interaction between them led to violence? And even if he genuinely can't remember the specifics of the attack itself, surely he remembers something about why he went there, what he was thinking, what state of mind he was in. But Eugene didn't provide any of those details. And whether that's because he truly doesn't remember, or because remembering would require admitting something he's not willing to admit, the family will probably never know. The apology Eugene offered, while emotional and seemingly sincere, rang hollow for many observers, because an apology without explanation, without full accountability, without the willingness to confront what you've done and why you did it, feels incomplete, feels like you're still holding something back, still protecting yourself even as you claim to be taking responsibility. Eugene apologized for the pain, apologized for the loss, apologized that he couldn't provide answers. But he didn't explain why he killed Leslie, didn't explain what he was doing at her house that morning, didn't explain how a young man who'd once dated her daughter ended up beating and strangling her to death in her own home. And for a family that had waited 23 years for answers, for understanding, for closure, his statement was inadequate, was another layer of loss on top of all the previous losses. The loss of Leslie, the loss of certainty about Sandy's innocence during his lifetime, the loss of security and trust, and now the loss of ever truly understanding what happened and why. Judge David Lease listened to the prosecutor's arguments, listened to Eugene's statement, listened to impact statements from Leslie's family that we'll talk about in a moment. And then he had to make a decision about sentencing, had to weigh all the factors Maryland law requires him to consider, the nature and circumstances of the offense, the history and character of the defendant, the impact on the victims and their families, the need to protect the public, the need for deterrence, the need for rehabilitation. All these competing considerations that judges balance when determining an appropriate sentence. The maximum sentence for second-degree murder in Maryland is 30 years. The prosecutors had requested that maximum, arguing that Eugene's conduct warranted the most severe punishment available, but the judge has discretion to impose less time if he believes the circumstances warrant it. And after considering all the evidence and arguments, Judge Lease announced his decision. He was imposing the maximum sentence, 30 years in prison, but suspending all but 22 years, meaning Eugene would serve 22 years behind bars, followed by 5 years of supervised probation upon his release. 22 years in prison. Eugene is currently 45 years old, so if he serves his full sentence without early release for good behavior or other factors, he'll be 67 years old when he gets out. An old man who spent more than 2 decades paying for a crime he committed as a young man. 22 years of his life taken in exchange for the life he took from Leslie. Though, of course, no amount of prison time can truly balance that equation. No sentence can bring Leslie back or undo the trauma her family experienced, or restore what was lost on May 2, 2001. Some observers thought 22 years was appropriate, a significant sentence that holds Eugene accountable while acknowledging that he has no prior criminal history, that he'd lived a law-abiding life for 23 years after the murder, that whatever drove him to kill Leslie appears to have been an aberration rather than the start of a pattern of violence. Other observers, particularly some of Leslie's family members, might have preferred the full 30 years, might have felt that anything less than the maximum doesn't adequately reflect the severity of what Eugene did and the decades of pain his actions caused. But Judge Lease has the responsibility and the authority to make that determination, and he decided 22 years was the appropriate sentence. The family impact statements at sentencing were powerful and heartbreaking. Several of Leslie's siblings testified about what her death had done to them, how it had shattered their sense of security, how they'd lost not just a sister but a piece of themselves, how the uncertainty of not knowing who killed her had been a constant weight for 23 years, how they'd watched their niece Lauren grow up without a mother, how they'd seen Sandy die under a cloud of suspicion that should never have existed. And now finally they had answers. Finally they had justice. Finally they could say with certainty that Sandy was innocent, that Eugene was guilty, that the nightmare was over, even though the loss would never be over. Lauren herself, according to attorney Benjamin Kurtz, who represented the family, wanted the court to know, wanted everyone to remember that her mother was a spectacular, loving, wonderful person, loved by family and friends, that Leslie wasn't just a victim, wasn't just a case file, wasn't just a name on an unsolved homicides list. She was a real person with a full life, and people who loved her, and a future that was stolen from her at age 49 when she should have had decades more to live. to watch her daughter grow up, to become a grandmother someday, to volunteer at the library teaching English to new immigrants, to do all the things that make up a life well lived. The vindication of Sandy Pria's memory was one of the most important outcomes of this case being solved, even more important in some ways than Eugene's conviction, because Sandy died in 2017, not knowing he would ever be cleared. Died, thinking some people in his community would always wonder if maybe he'd been involved in his wife's death. Died, carrying that burden on top of his grief for Leslie. Detective Augustine told ABC News that perhaps the most gratifying aspect of the investigation was clearing Leslie's husband of any involvement in the murder, giving that gift to Lauren of knowing with absolute certainty that her father was innocent, that the suspicion cast on him was wrong, that he'd been telling the truth all along when he said he didn't kill Leslie. Imagine being Lauren, spending your teenage and young adult years not entirely sure whether your father had killed your mother, having to live with that doubt, even if you believed in your heart he was innocent, having to watch him suffer under suspicion, knowing you couldn't be completely certain, and then having him die before the truth came out, before his name was cleared, and then finally in 2024 learning that yes, he was innocent, the DNA proved it, Eugene was the killer. Your father never should have been suspected at all, and feeling relief and vindication but also rage that he died without knowing, without that final peace of mind, without the public acknowledgement that he'd been wrongly accused. The broader implications of this case extend far beyond one family's tragedy. This case challenges our fundamental assumptions about safety and trust and how we determine who to let into our lives and our homes. Leslie Pria died because she trusted someone her daughter had trusted, because Eugene had been a familiar presence in their lives for years, because when he showed up at her door that morning in May 2001, whatever reason he gave for being there would have seemed plausible enough that she let him in. She didn't call the police. She didn't refuse him entry. She trusted him because she had history with him, because he'd been her daughter's boyfriend, because in her worldview, people from good families in good neighborhoods don't commit brutal murders. Except sometimes they do. Sometimes the danger comes not from strangers, but from people you know. People you've welcomed into your home. People who've sat at your dinner table and laughed at your jokes and seemed perfectly normal until the moment they're not normal anymore. Until some combination of circumstances triggers violence you never could have predicted. The Chevy Chase community was deeply affected by this case. Both the original murder in 2001 and the revelation in 2024 that the killer had been someone local, someone from their midst, someone who'd grown up in their neighborhood and gone to their schools and been part of their community. In 2001, the murder shattered Chevy Chase's sense of being a safe haven, a place where crime doesn't happen, where families can raise their children without fear, where you don't have to lock your doors or worry about violence, because that's what happens in other neighborhoods, not here. Not in this affluent suburb where everyone knows everyone and strangers stand out, and surely nothing terrible can happen. And then Leslie was murdered, and suddenly that safety was revealed as an illusion. Suddenly, everyone was looking at their neighbors differently, wondering if maybe the killer lived on their street, went to their church, shopped at their grocery store. The arrest of Eugene Gligor in 2024 brought those fears roaring back, but also provided a strange kind of closure. Now they knew who had done it. Now they could process the reality that yes, it was someone local, someone they might have known or seen around, but also someone who was now in custody, who couldn't hurt anyone else, who was being held accountable. The forensic genetic genealogy aspect of this case is revolutionary and deserves discussion because it represents a fundamental shift in how cold cases can be investigated and solved. Before this technology existed, before GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA and companies like Othram developed these techniques, the Leslie Pria case would have remained unsolved forever. The unknown male DNA under her fingernails would have sat in an evidence locker for 50 years, 100 years, perpetually unhelpful because it didn't match anyone in CODIS, and there was no way to identify who it belonged to. But genetic genealogy changed everything, changed the fundamental equation of what police can do with DNA evidence that doesn't match existing databases. The technique is controversial. There are legitimate privacy concerns about law enforcement accessing genealogical databases, about the implications of your distant relatives voluntarily submitting their DNA and thereby making you identifiable to police, even though you never consented to share your genetic information, about where the line should be drawn between public safety and personal privacy. But cases like Leslie Preer's make a compelling argument for the value of this technology when used appropriately, when used as a last resort after traditional methods have failed, when used to solve serious violent crimes rather than minor offenses. Maryland's approach to regulating genetic genealogy, requiring law enforcement to exhaust other investigative avenues before turning to familial DNA, seems like a reasonable balance between enabling justice and protecting rights. It prevents fishing expeditions while allowing this powerful tool to be used in cases where it's truly needed, where families have been waiting years or decades for answers, where traditional investigation has hit a dead end. And the success in the Preer case will likely lead to more Maryland cold cases being submitted for genetic genealogy analysis, more families getting answers they thought they'd never get, more killers who thought they'd gotten away with their crimes being brought to justice no matter how much time has passed. There's something powerful about the message this sends. You might think you got away with it because you're not in the criminal database, because you have no record, because you've been living a normal life for 20 years, or 30 years, or 40 years. But your DNA doesn't lie. Your genetic code is unique to you. And if you left it at a crime scene, if your victim fought back and got your DNA under their fingernails or on their clothing or anywhere that could be preserved, eventually, inevitably, science will catch up to you. Genetic genealogy will identify your family tree. Investigators will narrow down to you specifically. And justice will find you, no matter how long it takes. For Detectives Augustin and Dupuis, attending Eugene's sentencing hearing on August 28, 2025, was the culmination of 2 years of intensive work on this case. 2 years of building family trees and following leads and analyzing DNA results and coordinating with prosecutors and keeping Lauren informed and pushing forward, even when the investigation seemed impossibly complex, and seeing Eugene sentenced to 22 years in prison. Seeing the case officially closed. Seeing Leslie's family finally get the justice they'd been waiting for since 2001. That was the reward for all that work. That was why they'd wanted to be in the cold case unit in the first place. Augustin told reporters outside the courthouse after sentencing, "Today's a good day. It's bittersweet because the family has lost someone that was really great and important to them. But it's good to see the hard work has finally paid off, and that bittersweet quality, that mixture of satisfaction at solving the case and sadness that solving it can't bring Leslie back, can't undo the trauma, can't restore what was lost. That's the reality of cold case work. Victory is always partial. Justice is always incomplete. Closure is never really closure in the way that word suggests. But it's still important, still valuable, still worth fighting for because families deserve answers, victims deserve justice, and perpetrators deserve to be held accountable no matter how much time has passed. So what do we make of Eugene Theodore Gligor? This 45-year-old man who spent 23 years living in Washington, D.C., knowing he'd killed his ex-girlfriend's mother, who held down jobs and maintained relationships and went about his daily life as if he weren't carrying this massive secret, who could run into Lauren at a restaurant and make small talk like everything was normal, who only got caught because science advanced to the point where his distant relatives, DNA on a public genealogy website, led investigators back to him through the branches of his family tree all the way to Romania. Understanding Eugene is impossible because he won't give us the information we'd need to truly understand. He claims memory blackouts. He claims he can't explain his motive. He offers apologies without explanations, and we're left trying to construct a psychological profile from fragments and inference and speculation, which is deeply unsatisfying, but it's all we have. So let's try to piece together what we can about who Eugene was and is, and what might explain the inexplicable. First, we know Eugene had no criminal history before or after Leslie's murder, no arrests, no pattern of violence, no red flags that would have made anyone suspect he was capable of killing someone. And this is actually fairly common in cases of intimate partner violence or violence connected to intimate relationships. Many perpetrators of domestic homicide have no prior criminal record. Their violence isn't random or indiscriminate, but rather triggered by specific relationship dynamics, by feelings of betrayal or rejection or loss of control, by circumstances that create a perfect storm of rage or panic or desperation. Eugene and Lauren had broken up years before Leslie's death, so this wasn't a fresh breakup triggering immediate retaliation. But breakups can have long-lasting effects, especially first serious relationships, especially for young men who might struggle with feelings of inadequacy or abandonment. And it's possible, though purely speculative, that Eugene carried unresolved feelings about the relationship, about Lauren, about the Priya family, feelings that festered over time until some trigger, some event we'll never know about, brought him to Leslie's door on May 2nd, 2001. The neighbor's tip from January 2002 mentioned that the Gligor household had frequent police visits for noise complaints, underage drinking, and drug use, and Eugene himself claimed at sentencing that he was having blackouts from drugs and alcohol around the time of the murder. So substance abuse was clearly part of his life in his late teens and early 20s. And substance abuse doesn't excuse violence, doesn't make someone less responsible for their actions, but it can be a contributing factor in understanding how someone's judgment becomes impaired, how inhibitions are lowered, how situations escalate in ways they might not when everyone is sober. Though, again, we're speculating, because Eugene hasn't given us the full story, hasn't explained whether he was intoxicated when he went to Leslie's house, whether drugs or alcohol played a role in what happened between them, whether his claim of memory blackouts is genuine or convenient. What we know for certain is that Eugene made a choice to go to Leslie's house that day, made a choice to engage with her in whatever interaction occurred, made choices during those final moments that ended with her death. And regardless of his substance use or his claimed memory problems, he's responsible for those choices, responsible for their consequences, responsible for the 23 years of pain his actions caused. The psychology of living with a secret like this, of killing someone and then returning to normal life, of encountering the victim's daughter years later and pretending everything is fine. That's the part that's hardest to comprehend for most people, because most of us couldn't do it, couldn't carry that weight, couldn't look Lauren in the eye knowing we'd murdered her mother. Our conscience would destroy us. Our guilt would manifest in depression or anxiety or self-destructive behavior or confessions to friends or therapists or police. But some people, and we don't know if Eugene is one of them, can compartmentalize trauma and guilt, can separate their sense of self from their actions, can construct a narrative where what they did doesn't define who they are, where the murder becomes almost like something that happened to someone else, something they witnessed rather than something they committed. And this compartmentalization allows them to function normally, to maintain relationships, to live without outward signs of the crushing guilt you'd expect them to carry. We don't know if Eugene thought about Leslie daily, or if he'd successfully pushed it to the back of his mind. We don't know if he felt remorse, or if he justified it somehow to himself. We don't know if running into Lauren triggered guilt or fear or nothing at all. These are the questions a full psychological evaluation might answer, but that we'll probably never have answers to, because Eugene isn't talking beyond his courtroom statements. This case fits into broader patterns of intimate partner, Violence and violence connected to intimate relationships, even though Eugene and Lauren had broken up years before the murder, and even though the victim was Leslie rather than Lauren herself. Because the connection between Eugene and the Priya family came through that romantic relationship, through that intimacy and trust that was built during 5 years of dating. And violence connected to intimate relationships often extends beyond the partners themselves, to family members, to children, to anyone close to the person the perpetrator is fixated on or angry at or seeking revenge against. We see this pattern in domestic violence situations all the time. Abusers who kill their ex-partner's new boyfriend or girlfriend. Abusers who harm their ex-partner's children. Abusers who target family members as a way of hurting their ex-partner indirectly when they can't access the ex-partner directly. And while we don't know Eugene's specific motive for killing Leslie, it's possible his actions were connected to his feelings about Lauren, about their breakup, about the family that had welcomed him and then watched him leave Lauren's life. These are all speculative connections, but they fit patterns we see in intimate partner violence research. The question of why Leslie rather than Lauren, if this was indeed connected to the relationship, is something we'll never be able to answer without Eugene's cooperation. And he's not cooperating, not in any meaningful way beyond pleading guilty. But we can observe that targeting a family member rather than an ex-partner directly can be a way of inflicting maximum pain while maintaining some psychological distance from the act. It's easier for some perpetrators to harm someone adjacent to the person they have complicated feelings about than to harm that person directly. Or perhaps Leslie was simply more accessible that morning. Perhaps Eugene went to the house not intending violence, but events escalated. Perhaps he'd gone hoping to see or talk to Lauren and encountered Leslie instead, and something went wrong. We're deep into speculation here because without facts, we have nothing but possibilities. And the frustrating reality is that Eugene holds all the answers and has chosen not to share them, leaving everyone to construct theories that can never be verified. The future of cold case investigations is being transformed by genetic genealogy, and the Leslie Priya case is emblematic of this transformation, showing both the power and the potential of this technology to bring justice to families who've been waiting decades for answers. Since the Golden State Killer case in 2018, hundreds of cold cases have been solved using genetic genealogy, and that number will only grow as more law enforcement agencies adopt these techniques. As more forensic genealogy companies develop their capabilities, as more genetic profiles are uploaded to public databases, creating larger pools of comparative data, and as the technology improves to work with increasingly degraded or partial DNA samples, we're entering an era where the statute of limitations on murder, which doesn't exist in most jurisdictions, is being backed up by science that doesn't forget, that doesn't degrade the way human memory does, that doesn't get confused or intimidated or bought off the way witnesses might. DNA is patient and precise and ultimately unforgiving of perpetrators who thought time would protect them from consequences. This creates both opportunities and challenges. Opportunities to solve cases like Leslie Priya's that would otherwise remain forever unsolved, to give families closure they desperately need, to hold perpetrators accountable no matter how much time has passed, but also challenges around privacy, around the ethics of using relatives' genetic information to identify suspects, around the potential for false positives or misidentification if genetic genealogy isn't done carefully with appropriate oversight, around questions of how far back in time we should reach to prosecute crimes. Whether there's a point at which the person who committed a murder 40 or 50 years ago is so different from who they are now that prosecution serves no purpose beyond retribution. Maryland's approach of requiring exhaustion of other investigative methods before turning to genetic genealogy seems like a reasonable framework. But these questions will only become more pressing as the technology becomes more widespread and more powerful. as we develop the ability to predict physical characteristics from DNA, to estimate age and ancestry and other traits, to build increasingly detailed profiles of unknown perpetrators based solely on their genetic material. For Lauren Prieur and Leslie's extended family, the period after Eugene's sentencing in August 2025 represents a transition from living in uncertainty to living with painful certainty. From not knowing who killed Leslie to knowing it was someone they'd trusted, someone who'd been part of their family's life for years, and processing that knowledge, integrating it into their understanding of their own history, finding a way to move forward with this new information. That's the work they're doing now and will continue doing for years to come. Justice has been served in the legal sense. Eugene is in prison, the case is closed, the mystery is solved. But the emotional and psychological work of healing that's ongoing, that's lifelong. That's complicated by the fact that the person who killed Leslie wasn't a stranger, but someone Lauren loved when she was young. Someone whose presence in family photographs and memories can never be erased. Someone who will forever be connected to her most formative years and her most devastating loss. Lauren wanted people to remember her mother as a spectacular, loving, wonderful person, not just as a victim, not just as a cautionary tale about trust and violence, but as a complete human being who volunteered at her library teaching English as a second language, who was one of 8 siblings in a close family, who raised a daughter she adored, who had friends and interests and a full life before it was cut short on May 2nd, 2001. Leslie Prieur's legacy is carried forward by the people who loved her, by the students she taught who learned English and integrated into American society with her help, by her daughter Lauren, who survived trauma and uncertainty to build a life despite everything that was taken from her, by her siblings who testified at Eugene's sentencing about what she meant to them, and by the detectives and prosecutors who fought for 23 years' worth of justice, even though they never knew Leslie personally, never met her while she was alive, but came to know her through case files and photographs, and the stories her family told about, who she was and what she meant to them. The Chevy Chase community will remember Leslie Prieur's case as the day their sense of safety was shattered, as the day they learned that violence can come from within their community, not just from outside it, that affluent neighborhoods are not immune to tragedy, that knowing your neighbors doesn't guarantee they won't hurt you. And while these are painful lessons, they're also important ones. They remind us that security is always partial, that risk cannot be eliminated completely, that tragedy doesn't respect zip codes or property values or the social status of its victims, and perhaps most importantly, that our response to tragedy, our commitment to justice, our refusal to forget or give up, those are the things that define a community as much as its physical boundaries or demographic characteristics. Chevy Chase didn't forget Leslie Prieur. Law enforcement didn't give up on her case. And ultimately that persistence paid off, even if it took 23 years. Even if Sandy didn't live to see his name cleared. Even if justice came too late to undo the trauma or bring Leslie back. We're left with uncomfortable questions about trust and intimacy and how we decide who to let into our lives. Leslie Prieur let Eugene Gliger into her home because he'd been her daughter's boyfriend, because she knew him, because trust had been established over years of interaction. And that trust was betrayed in the most violent way possible. And this reality challenges our instincts about safety because we want to believe that people we know are safer than strangers, that history together provides some guarantee against violence, that we can read people accurately and judge their character reliably. But the truth is more complicated and more frightening. The truth is that some perpetrators of violence are skilled at presenting themselves as trustworthy, at building relationships that give them access to victims, at maintaining masks of normalcy that hide their capacity for harm. And sometimes violence erupts from people we thought we knew, people we trusted, people we welcomed into our homes and our families, not because we made some obvious mistake in judgment, but because humans are complicated and capable of surprise, and sometimes the darkness that lives in someone only manifests under specific circumstances that we couldn't have predicted. This doesn't mean we should trust no one, doesn't mean we should live in fear of everyone we know, doesn't mean we should isolate ourselves in the name of safety. But it does mean we should recognize that certainty about other people's character is always limited. That trust should be calibrated to the reality that humans are capable of both great kindness and terrible violence. Sometimes within the same person, sometimes at different times in their lives. And that maintaining appropriate boundaries, listening to our instincts when something feels off, staying connected to friends and family who can offer outside perspectives. These are all reasonable approaches to reducing risk without eliminating the human connection and intimacy that make life meaningful. Leslie Preer's death wasn't her fault, wasn't the result of poor judgment or excessive trust, was simply the tragic intersection of her life with someone who made a terrible choice. And blaming victims for trusting people they had reason to trust is never appropriate, never helpful. Never anything but a way of making ourselves feel safer by believing we'd be smarter, more cautious, better at identifying danger, when the reality is that any of us could be in Leslie's situation, given the wrong circumstances and the wrong person. The technology that solved this case, genetic genealogy, represents our collective commitment to justice, even when justice takes decades to achieve. Represents our belief that murder matters regardless of when it occurred, that victims deserve investigation and resolution and accountability for their deaths, that families deserve answers even if those answers come 20 or 30 or 40 years after their questions were first asked. And this commitment to long-term justice is something worth celebrating, even as we acknowledge its limitations. Even as we recognize that justice served decades late doesn't undo trauma or restore what was lost. It's still worth pursuing because the alternative, accepting that some murders will simply never be solved, that some families will never get answers, that some perpetrators will never face consequences, that alternative is unacceptable in a society that values human life and claims to care about justice. The investment in cold case units, in genetic genealogy programs, in training detectives like Augustine and Dupuy, who have the patience and skill to work cases that have gone nowhere for decades. These investments pay dividends in solved cases, in families who can finally begin to heal, in perpetrators who learn that time will not protect them from accountability. Eugene Gleiger filed a motion asking the court to reconsider his sentence, to reduce it from the 22 years Judge Lease imposed. And this motion is typical of defendants who receive significant sentences. They almost always appeal, almost always ask for reconsideration, almost always try to reduce their time. And the court will consider Eugene's motion and almost certainly deny it because the sentence was within legal guidelines, was well justified by the evidence and the impact on the victims, and doesn't reflect any obvious error or injustice that would warrant reconsideration. So Eugene will likely serve those 22 years, will spend them thinking about what he did and why he did it. Whether he chooses to confront those questions honestly or continues to hide behind claims of memory loss. And when he's released as an old man in his late 60s, he'll emerge into a world that's moved on without him, a world where Leslie's family has built lives and found whatever healing they could find, a world where genetic genealogy has solved hundreds more cold cases, a world that won't forget what he did, but also won't be defined by it. The final lesson of Leslie Preer's case is about persistence, about the value of never giving up, even when a case seems hopeless, even when years pass with no new leads, even when the technology to solve it doesn't yet exist. Because if Montgomery County had closed this case permanently, had decided it was unsolvable and stopped maintaining the evidence, had given up on Leslie's family and moved on to cases that seemed more promising, then when genetic genealogy technology developed, When Augustin and Dupuy joined the cold case unit, when the tools to identify Eugene finally existed, there would have been no case to work, no evidence to analyze, no opportunity to bring him to justice. The physical evidence from Leslie's fingernails was preserved for 23 years, waiting for technology to catch up. The case file was maintained and organized. Tips were documented even when they led nowhere. And all that work by dozens of investigators over more than 2 decades. All that persistence and careful stewardship of evidence and refusal to forget. That's what made justice possible in 2024. That's what gave Lauren answers about who killed her mother. That's what cleared Sandy's name, even though he didn't live to see it. That's what put Eugene Gleiger in prison where he belongs. So when you hear about a cold case in your community, when you see a police department asking for tips about a murder that happened 20 or 30 years ago, when you wonder why they're still working on cases that seem hopeless, remember Leslie Prier. Remember that persistence pays off, that science advances, that new techniques emerge, that what seems unsolvable today might be solvable tomorrow or next year or 20 years from now. And the families of victims, they don't stop grieving. They don't stop wanting answers. They don't stop deserving justice just because time passes. And our commitment to providing that justice, to working these cases no matter how long it takes, to never giving up on victims or their families, that commitment is what separates a society that values human life from one that treats unsolved murders as acceptable losses, as just the cost of doing business in a world where crime happens and some cases don't get solved. Leslie Prier's case is now closed. Eugene Gleiger is in prison. Lauren has answers. Sandy's memory is vindicated, and the lesson for all of us, the takeaway from this hour and a half we've spent together exploring this case, is that justice delayed is still justice, that cold cases can be solved, that families can get answers even decades later, that perpetrators who think they got away with murder will eventually face consequences when science and persistence catch up to them. And maybe, just maybe, there's someone watching this right now who committed a murder 20 or 30 years ago, who thinks they got away with it because they're not in any database, because no one ever suspected them, because the case went cold and they moved on with their lives. And maybe they're feeling a cold chill right now, understanding that genetic genealogy is coming for them, that their DNA is unique, that their family tree exists in public records, that detectives like Augustin and Dupuy are out there right now working cold cases with the same techniques that caught Eugene Gleiger. And maybe that person is realizing that the life they've built on a foundation of violence and secrecy is built on sand, that eventually, inevitably, science will identify them. Law enforcement will find them, and justice will come for them no matter how much time has passed. Because DNA doesn't forget, families don't stop caring, and cold case detectives don't give up. They just keep working, keep analyzing, keep building family trees and following leads until suddenly, after years or decades, they knock on your door and say, "We know what you did. We can prove it and your time is up." That's the legacy of Leslie Prier's case. That's the message to anyone who thinks they got away with murder. You haven't, not really, not permanently. You're just living on borrowed time until genetic genealogy finds you. And when it does, justice will finally be served no matter how long you've been waiting for that knock on the door. Because it's coming, it's always coming. And there's nowhere to hide from your own DNA, from the genetic fingerprint you left behind that will eventually, inevitably, lead investigators right to you, just like it led them to Eugene Gleiger, 23 years after he thought he'd gotten away with murder. Leslie Prier was 49 years old when she died. A mother, a sister, a volunteer, a friend, a person who mattered to many people and whose absence has been felt every day for 24 years. And now she has justice. Now her family has answers. Now her killer is in prison where he belongs. And while none of that brings Leslie back, while justice delayed is still a kind of injustice to everyone who suffered through the decades of not knowing, it's still worth celebrating, still worth fighting for. Still worth remembering as proof that persistence matters, that families deserve answers, that cold cases can be solved, and that in the end, the truth has a way of coming out, even when it takes 23 years, and revolutionary genetic genealogy technology, and 2 dedicated detectives, and a community that refused to forget. Rest in peace, Leslie Prior. Your case is closed. Your killer is behind bars. Your family knows the truth, and your memory lives on in everyone who fought for justice in your name, and everyone who will remember your story as proof that no matter how long it takes, the truth will eventually emerge, justice will eventually be served. And cold cases can become closed cases when persistence meets science, and dedicated investigators refuse to give up on victims and their families. That's the story of Leslie Prior. That's the lesson of her case. And that's why cold case detectives do what they do. Because cases like this, resolutions like this, justice like this, no matter how delayed, no matter how bittersweet, this is what makes the work worthwhile and gives hope to every family still waiting for answers about their own unsolved tragedies. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.